So great. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me, and I'm really looking forward to it. And let's just jump in by letting me ask you, how did you originally get interested in Russia?
Oh, Daniel, it is a interesting story with a lot of serendipitous twists along the way. I'll start from the very beginning and paint this picture. So basically, it started in high school. I was, in those days in my public high school in Portchester, New York, you had a choice of studying Italian, Spanish, or French as a foreign language. That was it. That's all my school offered. And of course, I was studying Spanish, but in my junior year, one of the language teachers said, "Hey, I teach Russian as well. Would you be interested?" And I thought, oh, that's really, really very interesting. And I said yes. So on the side, she started teaching me, very, very elementary Russian, my God. But it was an old textbook and it was a good start. I was the only person in the entire school who signed up for this little extracurricular activity, you might say, Daniel. But it opened a world of fascination to a language.
Just briefly, what year was this?
This was in 1976. No,
Okay.
no, 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 it wasn't. Um, Yeah, I guess 1976. Yes.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
we were deep in the Soviet Union in those days, and Russia, in addition to the language being fascinating, and having this teacher willing to take her personal time, basically, to open this world to me and spend a little time teaching me basic Russian, it really did kindle quite a fascination. And because of that, I graduated high school and I went to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and I was a political science major. But very quickly in my freshman year, that bug on Russia came back, and I joined this special program. It's called the College Scholar Program, where you're able to design your own major. And I thought that, well, Russia or the Soviet Union at that time was such a massive presence and it was our competitor in the world. And, it was warranted for many reasons to study this in depth. And I was, obviously already hooked on Russia from an early age. So I took up a major that I created called Sino-Soviet Studies. So I was studying Russia and also started to study China as well, because I thought that these three, plus with the United States, these three powers really sort of dominated the world scene, and one had to be proficient in understanding them to be, part of a solution or an ongoing engagement. So
Yeah.
that's how it started. This is in 1977, and I kept studying Russian. In my um, sophomore year, I started studying Chinese as well, and the major went very well. What I was studying was basically political science, history, more or less starting from the Bolshevik Revolution era, the late early 20th century to present, and then about the same parallel for China as well. So I tell you, one week I'd be studying the collective speeches of Brezhnev, and then it would be looking at dipping inside Mao Zedong's little red book. So it was, and I started studying Chinese, which, just took that fascination with language one step further, because as you can imagine, Russian already is quite exotic. And when you go to
Right.
Chinese, you're almost in a different world.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember after, basically one semester of Chinese at Cornell, they gave us the first book to read. And it was, of course, not complex. It was sort of like probably a sixth grader's book in China. But to read a book in just Chinese characters was such a feeling of empowerment and fascination that kept me going.
Right.
So two things happened at that time, very pivotal things in my life and in my career, and I will tell you both of them. So first, I love these stories. So first, both serendipity plus very fatalistic. The first thing that happened is over one vacation in sometime in 1978, I went back home. I was in my grandmother was living at our house during that time, and she pulled out a shoebox because she knew I started studying Russian at Cornell. So she pulled out a shoebox, and in this shoebox were letters from the Soviet Union dated 1960. So my grandmother immigrated from the Russian Empire. It wasn't even the Soviet Union, and she immigrated to the U.S. around 1905. And her naturalization certificate at Ellis Island, in identifying her, called her a what grajdanstvo, what was it called? Um, the of the Soviet of the Russian Empire, predmet Ruskoy Imperia, a subject of the Russian Empire, which was completely fascinating. So this is where my grandmother enters the story as a predmet Ruskoy Imperia who immigrated to the United States circa 1905. She pulls out this this very ragged shoebox of letters, and I start reading them. And of course, I can't read them perfectly because my Russian still at that time was not at such a adequate level. But these were letters from her brother to her, and her brother never succeeded in immigrating to the United States. The plan was back in 1905, send a few young people, have them, the story well with immigrants, start working, earn some money. You earn enough money and establish yourself, bring everyone else over. But the World War I erupted, the Bolshevik Revolution interceded, and some of her family, because of those events, never succeeded in leaving Russia, and then ultimately it became the Soviet Union. So it turns out that one branch of my family never left Russia and grew up in Russia. And, fast forward to 1960, and her brother, who is still there, is writing letters to her. And he's still alive, he was still alive at that time. So I took a letter, this is 1978, from 1960, and just out of a lark, in my still fairly poor Russian, wrote back to him at the same address. No, excuse me. My grandmother's brother had died already by that time. And he was already passed away. But anyway, I wrote back to that address in a lark. And then, believe it or not, almost 3 months later, a letter came back from the Soviet Union, that same address. And who wrote it but the grandson of that original grandfather, the brother of my grandmother who passed away many, many years ago. So this family connection, lost for almost 20 years and broken for almost a century, came back to life, and I started to write him. And this is 1978. This is the heart. This is deep in Soviet times, and that's why it took 3 months to get a letter through the censors, and it's amazing you even got the letter, period. But we started corresponding, and what happened, I'll just finish this thread because there are some other ones as well that are pivotal in the story we'll tell today. So how that developed is we kept corresponding over the years, and after I graduated Cornell in 81, I went to Georgetown where I was getting my master's in foreign service, and I was already in Asia at the time. We'll talk about that in a second. But in 1983, I was in Hong Kong for my first assignment. Well, one of my assignments was Citibank, and I wrote to him and I said, well, I'm in Hong Kong. Why don't I try to visit you? I'll take the Trans-Siberian train. I'll fly up to Beijing. I'll take the Trans-Siberian train from Beijing to Moscow, and maybe you can meet me in Moscow. And my relatives at this time, I don't know what I would call him, like a second cousin or exactly how you would define that. They were living in Yevpatoria, which was in the Crimea, not far from Simferopol, like, 30 less than 60-minute drive from Simferopol. They were living in Yevpatoria, which is a beautiful seaside town full of, health resorts and things like that. So I got up my Russian visa, my Soviet visa. This is during Andropov, I believe. And I got the visa, ended up in Beijing and took the train, a 7-day train, all across Eurasia, which was probably the most amazing journey I ever had in my life.
Yeah.
And Daniel, it was probably the most cost-effective journey because I think the cost of each kilometer of travel was 50 cents or something like that. The whole journey in the second class coupe was like $200 one way. So,
Right.
and
Right.
in that wagon, in those days, foreigners were put in a special foreigner car. You were not allowed to mix with Russians, basically. So I had another American, an Italian, and a British guy, the four of us, and we had a simply wild time going across Eurasia, ending up in Moscow. So that really added to my Russian adventure to such a high degree, that whole family episode. But let's go back in time because there was a strategic interruption. And back again to 1978. So now I am once again a sophomore at Cornell. I am a Russian Sino-Soviet studies major. I'm already 2 years of college Russian under the belt. And I applied for the summer language program, as many did in those days, to the Leningrad State University Russian language program for the summer of 1980, which made a hell of a lot of sense given what I was doing.
Right.
So, and I got accepted. And just something happened though, and it was December 25th, 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the relations with the US and Russia just fell apart, and they were very, very bad. And I was just looking at the overall situation and asking myself, well, wait a minute, do you really want to go to the Soviet Union in this situation? Because these were really very, very tough times. And I started thinking maybe that wasn't the right time for this. And I applied because I had now started studying Chinese. I applied for a summer Chinese language program in Taipei, Taiwan, the Stanford program, which again was the premier, language program to study Chinese abroad. And in those days, in 1978, as you can imagine, going to mainland China was very tough. Very few people did it. And people were just basically saying, listen, if you want to get a better opportunity to mix with Chinese and study Chinese, you're better off going to Taipei than going to mainland China. And by the way, afterwards, I found out that the food is a hell of a lot better in Taipei than it was in Beijing at the time, among other things.
Right.
So I made that shift. I did not go to Leningrad. I went to Taipei and studied Chinese that summer. This is the summer of 1980. And the Chinese I met, the Chinese I learned, the other foreigners who were there studying with me, turned out to be an absolute amazing period. And it was well worth it. It was a great decision. But what that meant was that now that emphasis on China really, tipped the scale. And there's another reason for that is, just look at this. You're about to graduate your university. This is the beginning of 1981. And you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do with my political science, Sino-Soviet studies degree? And, in those days, there was very little you could do with Russian studies. Academia or the State Department or maybe the CIA, there was no business at all, basically. Very, very, very little. So the job opportunities were quite limited. But with China and Asia, things were really booming. China was opening up. And I said, well, now that I've got both of these under my belt, and in those days, not many people were studying Chinese. So you still had as an American, you had a relatively rare skill set than many other people. So I decided to increase my emphasis on China at that time. And a few things happened that helped me. So I applied to Georgetown for my master's. I started in the fall of 1982. That was now I had 2 summers of Chinese study under my belt. Fall of 1982. And during that first year at Georgetown, Georgetown sponsored a cocktail party with recently graduated alums in New York City. So I took the train from Washington, went up to New York City, went to this event, and I meet a gentleman called Lou Viata, who had graduated Georgetown MSFS 4 years before I did, and he was employed by Citibank in their brand new opened People's Republic of China representative office. And he looks at my CV and he goes, "Well, how would you like a summer internship with Citibank? Join me in Hong Kong for the summer. Help us, with our new representative office." And it took me about 3 seconds to say, "I'm on board for sure."
Absolutely.
So I go out there, and I was still thinking State Department at that time. But what happened was, working with Citibank, I realized, hey, I could do this stuff too. I didn't have accounting then. I didn't really have I didn't have an MBA. I was pursuing, international relations with a Sino-Soviet angle at Georgetown as well. But I realized that, I could do this, and Citi offered me a job after that summer and said, when you get your degree at Georgetown the next year, join us, and we'll put you in the training program and we'll teach you everything you don't know. It was a half-year training program, accounting, finance, credit work, how to be a banker. It was a very, very tough program. It was tantamount to half an MBA, courtesy of Citibank. But the catch was, if you failed any of the exams, you would lose your job. You'd be fired.
Wow.
So it was very high pressure and not easy because, my background was I did not have an MBA background. It was international relations. But I passed, luckily, and I was accepted. And after 1 year in New York doing M&A and other kinds of high-ranking kind of leveraged capital business, they sent me, my wish was to be sent as an international staff to Taiwan, and they said, that's where we're going to send you. And for the next 6 or 7 years, I was working in Taiwan as an international staff of Citibank, doing a lot of great things, very much embedded into banking, and enjoying being in Asia. I started studying Japanese as well, which in those days was the other professional language. You really had to understand Japan in those days. Just imagine 1980s, Japan was the future power. Like we say about China now, everyone was saying that Japan was the future economic power of the world. So I started studying Japanese as well, just to round out that Asian experience. So let's continue the timeline.
Let's jump to
where does Russia come
in? Right, where's Russia here?
So basically, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. I'm in Taiwan, and I'm going, well, wait a minute, the whole world has changed. The Berlin Wall has fallen. Russia and Eastern Europe is opening up now. Now, why don't I go back to my Russian studies roots and take advantage of everything I've done and do something that I've always wanted? Why don't I shift my focus? It was pretty daring to do that because Asia was really booming. Why don't I shift my focus back to Russia and pursue that? Now that the business opportunities were opening up, and of course, I was in Citibank. That was a great place to be. I felt I had a long-term career there, but I saw that now Eastern Europe and Russia could be part of that long-term Citibank career trajectory. So I started to shift. I was planning to do that.
And was Citibank also shifting at the same time, or were you?
Absolutely. No, I didn't. I was a very low-level guy. But just, in 1993, Citibank decided, after leaving or being kicked out of Russia in 1918, Citibank decided to come back to Russia. They opened up a representative office in 1993. And in 1994, they received their commercial banking license, which they had originally received on December 31st, 1916. And of course, it was revoked by the Bolsheviks in due course.
Right.
So Citibank came back, and I was, asked, would you like to come to Russia to be part of this? And,
Mm.
after a
But were
few,
you asked or you pushed for it? Just curious.
no, it's always both because you have to express interest, but
Yeah,
and there were not many people wanting that job. That was very wild then, and
yeah.
it was a very very tough assignment living in Russia. It was a hardship post, as Citibank would say.
Ah,
It was a
okay.
hardship post.
And at that time, what was Citibank's reasoning? Why then, and what kind of due diligence did they do before jumping into Russia in those years?
Well, you have to read my first book, Into Russia's Cauldron, because it is a complete repeat of the story that happened in
Ah,
1916.
okay.
And that was a true story. And history, believe it or not, was repeating itself very much to the single letter. But Citibank thought that, well, wait a minute, if the country is changing and it may, this is already 1993, the fall of the Soviet Union, if it's going, which happened in 1991, if if Russia is going to change and open up to the world, there's an enormous amount of business opportunities to open up all of these industries and American technology, American capital, American management expertise, all of the foreign investment that would flow into Russia, that Citibank with its global network, cash management network, and the fact that it has customers in all different countries. It was just a very logical business opportunity for Citibank. And Citibank, as other foreign banks, jumped in and said, let's take advantage of
Yeah.
this
And
window.
basically, then it was to service or facilitate um, um, international entry into Russia. So your clients were going to be international companies, correct?
Yeah, well, it's a two-part story, which is happens with Citi all over the world. In the beginning, it was exactly that. Citi had thousands of multinational clients. Procter and Gamble, for example, wants to sell its toothpaste and its deodorant and its products to Russians, or IKEA, or Chevron wants to, open up, create an oil production facility or refinery, etc. So every company, every international company, be it American or European or Japanese, um, they had their own business opportunities and interest in Russia, and Citi was there to help them with mundane things like FX, cash management, but also more advanced commercial and investment banking products like mergers and acquisition, um, long-term capital financing, export credit finance, a whole bevy of different financial products from simple to quite complex. That
Mm,
was phase one, but phase two followed logically, more slowly, but it logically followed is that ultimately, once you have your foot in Russia and you understand what's starting to happen in Russia, you're looking at the Russian companies themselves or state enterprises that were transforming into some form of private company and asking, well, how can we help them as well? Because they need the same expertise, the same services as they develop and invest in Russia. And as they might start thinking about, they need to, outreach outside of Russia. They need to import technology and goods, raw materials. They need to sell in foreign currencies and therefore hedging and FX transactions. They will have cash in rubles and in dollars or euros or pounds. They need, a bank that knows how to manage those cash and, and facilitate cash flows. So it only made sense and it happened, but it took slower for Citi and again, all the other foreign banks doing the same thing to start working with Russian companies. And in those days, this is up to 1998. It was very hard to work with Russian companies for several reasons. First, they had almost no audited printed financial statements. So you had no idea what is going on in this company, who really owns it, what are their state of finances, what do they do with their money. You really didn't know. And without that kind of knowledge, there's no way you're going to lend them money because it's like putting money in a very dangerous black or red box. And in the late 1990s, as you know, Russia was really the Wild East. So you had to be extremely careful for those reasons that I just mentioned, but also, Citi as a, international, American listed company with very high American professional standards, had to be very, very careful who it worked with. You had the due diligence was astronomically important and very difficult. You cannot work with a criminal. You have to know, where did this money come from? How did this company form? Who owns it? And that meant that most of the Russian companies that were forming and might have been interested in working with a bank like Citibank, we probably just couldn't work with them for reasons of professional due diligence and keeping that bar very, very high. So that was a very big challenge in the late 1990s. But by the early 2000s, when oil prices started coming up, the Russian companies realized that, well, in order to create more value and to make their shareholders richer, they really should adopt, as best as they could or they wanted to, Western standards of transparency, compliance, management, etc. So you saw in the early 2000s a gradual transformation of a lot of newly formed or transformed Russian companies trying to adopt to Western standards. And some of them did it better than others. But it was still very difficult because you still could not, drop your professional standards, your due diligence standards. It was still very difficult to work with a lot of companies. And basically, Citi ultimately worked with just a small selection of them for those reasons.
Right. Right.
And I had moved to Russia. Ultimately, I was looking at a position in 1997, right before the currency crisis in August 1998. But for personal reasons, an opportunity came up in London to do emerging markets. And I decided to be in London first for those years, from 1997 to 1999 at that time. No, excuse me, from 1999 to the beginning of 2002.
Okay, but before we back to the 1993, 1996,
Yeah.
you were involved with the bank at that point, or you weren't?
Yeah, I was in the bank. I was in the bank.
But you weren't involved with the Russian
No, I was not.
office.
I was
Okay,
not. I was
okay.
looking at it. I was starting to reach out to get to know these people and understand what they were doing. But in terms of, I started going to Russia for business in 1997 and 1998.
Okay, as
Okay,
part of
so
the emerging market.
yeah, as that bigger emerging markets focus and bailiwick.
Okay.
But I wasn't posted in Russia at that time. But starting 1997, I was very embedded doing corporate finance, going there every month, starting to meet Russian clients, working closely with my Russian colleagues.
And the Citibank had
Yeah.
Russian nationals who were part of the
Yeah,
staff.
it certainly did. It certainly did. But funny enough, I think I was probably the only foreigner, and I wasn't even stationed there, who actually spoke Russian, who had the Russian studies academic background. So
Uh-huh.
I was, again, pretty young at the time. What was it, 1978? So I'm only 1970, well, no, excuse me, not 1997. So I am like 38 years old.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm not in Russia yet, but I'm very much involved in 1997, 1998. And then, of course, in August 1998 was the collapse of the ruble, and Russia sort of went bankrupt, defaulted on its foreign currency obligations. And that slowed things down in Russia for about 2 or 3 years.
And what did you think yourself when that happened? Did you think this is over, or did you think this is a temporary setback? How did you, as a person in the banking industry and in emerging markets, think about that?
Well, yeah, it was a shock to everyone, although some people saw it coming. But from a banker's point of view, it was like, okay, the risk rating of this country has just plummeted, and all the red flags are out there. So don't lend any money. Cut down on your credit exposure if you had some. Watch the space. But we never exited. We did not exit because Russia still was opening up. They got hit on the head with a sledgehammer, you might say, but they were
Right.
still out there. And frankly, when you're just doing FX transactions for multinationals who need you desperately to do that, that's basically zero risk business.
Okay.
So the bank.
So Citibank didn't lose money in
Oh
that
no, it
process.
did. It lost a few, like 150, $200 million because it had exposure to Russian government assets and
The GKOs.
yeah, exactly. So, it's too bad that happened to Citi, but it did happen. And again, it just is, it is a parallel to what happened to Citibank in 1917. So you go back to my book and you say, oh my God, Citibank lost money then. In those days, they lost $10 million, which you think, oh, that's nothing. But $10 million in 1917 represented 10% of Citibank's global capital.
Whoa.
So that was almost enough to bankrupt, to crater the whole bank in those days. So that was a serious, serious blow to Citi in 1917, 1918 when that happened. And guess what? It happened again. This time the loss was 10, 20 times larger, but that loss as a percentage of Citibank's capital was much, much smaller. So it didn't really stop or dent Citibank much at all. It gave them a black eye, you might say. But it
Right.
didn't stop Citi, and Citi was still and then again, it's not just Citi, it's other foreign banks as well, the HSBCs, the the Lloyds Bank, you have the Credit Lyonnais, the German banks. Banks were still there, but they obviously really slowed down between 1998 and 2001. And what happened in 2001? The price of oil started going up. And all of a sudden, Russia was exporting oil, as you know, it was their lifeline. And all of a
Right.
sudden, exports of oil brought in enormous amounts of much greater revenues. And Russia's macro, financial position started to improve greatly. And all these companies started to, once again, benefit from that oil boom because the oil boom did trickle down in conjunction with a lot of what I would call modified and more liberal financial policies and economic management policies that Putin started implementing once he became president in 2000. It just led to a big renaissance of Russian business. So by 2002, Russia was really very ebullient, buoyant, and starting to go places because of that oil price boom. So banks reoriented once again, saying, well, wait a minute, what happened in 1998? Those days are gone. We've learned our lesson, but the opportunities are back and they're bigger and better than ever.
Right.
And at that minute, I moved to Russia and started working in Russia.
All right. So 2002.
Two. Yeah, March 2002, I moved to Russia with my family. I had my wife and my two young girls. They went to the American, the stories are endless. They ended up going to the American school in Anglo-American School of Moscow, which was obviously closed recently by the Russians. But we moved there and started to really embed ourselves in Russia, and it was the beginning of the big oil price-driven economic boom in Russia. And
Where were you living?
I was living in Rosinka, which was a big, it was mainly foreign lived, although Russians lived there as well, a big housing compound, a very, very lovely housing compound, about, depending on how bad the traffic was, anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours drive from the center of Moscow on Leningradskoye Chaussee up toward Mozhaisk area.
Right.
But a very comfortable place, very, very nice, somewhat, removed from the center of Russia, but quite accessible as long as the traffic wasn't horrendous on any particular day. And, we made a lot of friends there and really, really enjoyed living there. The school commute for the kids was sometimes not so good either, depending on the traffic. And it just got worse over time. And we ultimately moved 3 years later, 4 years later to Pokrovsky Hills, which was a a compound, a lovely townhouse compound that was situated right next to the Anglo-American school,
Okay.
which,
And when we're finished, I'll tell you a story about Rosinka, but go ahead. Yeah.
well, anyway, so we moved there. We're jumping ahead, but we were just talking about living arrangements right now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we'll go back again.
Right. So 2002, how big was the office when you moved there?
It must have been, oh God, about in 2002, it probably was close to 100 people at that time.
About 100 people. So
Yeah,
it had grown substantially over that period
yeah.
of time, you
Well,
said.
when I was when I had left, stopped going in 1998 when the default happened, I think at that time it was probably 50, 60 people. And it gradually grew. I can't remember exactly. I think it was something between 60 to 100 people when I moved there.
Yeah. And
That grew
majority
very quickly.
Russian nationals?
Mainly Russian nationals, but in those days there were probably about 10 to 15 expats,
Yeah.
which was a very large amount. Now, in Russia, no surprise for several reasons. One, because the Russians still did not really have the Western banking skills, so you had to bring in much more experienced Western bankers to help train and infuse that knowledge. And then, of course, the management of the process. But the Russians we hired were very smart, Western oriented, and they learned quickly and they performed very, very well. And, I'll just go back to a quote. This is January 2002, just when I accepted the position in Moscow and before I actually moved there in the beginning of March. I still remember a colleague going to me, an English colleague or an American colleague in London going, "Oh, you're moving to Russia." And then she asked, "Is that what you wanted?" As, as, as if, as if I was being sent on a Strafe battalion, or I was being sent, as a punishment assignment or something
Right,
like
right. And
that.
this
I,
was true even in 2002. Yeah. Wow.
I found that, really amusing.
Yeah,
But you know what? In a way, I said this is great because that means that most people don't know what I'm on to. They don't
yeah,
know what's happening now in Russia, and I am going to be helping opening a really broad, exciting new frontier.
right. And so were you so socially, once you're located there and you're in the bank, you're busy, are you integrated into the expat community or you leach into Russian society, but to the extent that they're different? And socially, what was your milieu like?
Okay, good question. Well, I was extremely integrated both into Russian society and, of course, naturally with the expat community as well. And the expat community, as you know, was very, very broad. It wasn't just American, it was European, Japanese, a smattering of other Asians as well, a few Latinos from Mexico, for example. I can tell you so many stories. But then again, read my new anthology book. You'll know the story there. But anyway,
Right.
back to that question. I w- Being a banker in a private company, I had no restrictions, unlike my American colleagues who worked in the U.S. Embassy, who had a lot of restrictions, who ultimately didn't know many Russians or couldn't go out for whatever reasons to the bars, to the restaurants, to the clubs, the nightclubs, everything. Their access to Russians was, in a way curtailed or even self-limited. But for me, that never happened. There were a few reasons for that. One is that my connection in the expat community were exceptionally broad because my customers, I was a customer banker. My customers, I had, 500 multinational customers who were working with Citi in Russia from all over the place. And I knew these people. So I'd go out with my Japanese client one day. I'd meet my Singaporean ambassador friend. I'd be with various Europeans, various Americans. So I had a very, very broad integration with everyone in the expat community from every possible country because of my business, my clients. And I was building the Russian clientele because I spoke Russian. Um, we decided at that time, again, because of the oil price boom, to really now dig into the Russian clientele and expand it quickly. Again, never foregoing the due diligence and the professional standards we had, but really get into that sector because it's booming, and that was great opportunity. And that's what I did. So I started meeting and being with Russians all the time. And they loved me because they knew I liked Russia. They knew I understood Russia. And we would go to Cafe Pushkin for kasha in the morning, or, we would go to restaurants, and there were plenty of them. I'd be with the Russians all the time. And
Yeah.
it helped my Russian get better, and it really gave me a great perspective. And another thing I did, which was a great decision, is I never stopped studying Russian, and I never stopped trying to improve my understanding of Russia. So I hired a Russian teacher, and we studied Russian like twice a week for like the first 2 or 3 years I was there, and we did amazing things. So we would read like Pushkin's no darn what was the name of that, all those fabulous, what was his I'm so embarrassed to forget this because I'm not no give me a second, I'm going to just Google it, and I'm so sorry for forgetting this, because this, I read the whole book, but it was instrumental. Just give me a second.
Okay. It wasn't Onegin.
I will find it because it is important. Yeah, Yevgeny Onegin, of course,
Onegin. Yeah. Yeah.
which is a fabulous piece of Russian literature. And what we did is we read it in Russian, and this book that she gave me had the English side by side. So, no, actually, it didn't. I was given that as a gift later. We read Yevgeny Onegin in the original Russian, line by line, and of course, this is Russian written in the 1820s, and a lot of the wording you wouldn't understand in those days. So right by my side, she would explain everything that I just couldn't understand myself, because she had that
Right.
historical perspective. So we would do this. And the other great thing about that arrangement is her brother happened to be the art director at the Tretyakov Gallery. And
Oh, wow.
he introduced me to all the modern Russian artists. I'd go to their studios. We would go out for tea. I would be given private tours of the Tretyakov Gallery. And I tell you, after 2 years, I knew almost every piece of work in that gallery, and I could do my own tours. And I did for other foreigners visiting Moscow. I knew that art and the history of it so well because I had this amazing connection.
Yeah.
So this is what I was doing, and it was intensely rewarding as someone who was a Russian studies major
Yeah.
to have this, great career opportunity, but these benefits, these cultural plus benefits that were happening because of the Russians I met.
Right. I want to go back to your recruiting of Russian clients. Who was your favorite Russian company that you ended up being a client of yours?
Vimpelcom, the telecom company, was great, and I worked with Sibneft a lot. Vimpelcom was great because they were such a forward, Western engaging company. They did everything right. Plus, they had an amazing business proposition, and they went public in the U.S. stock exchange. Fabulous company to work with, growing, just the kind of company Citibank wants, with good management. I worked with Sibneft, which was owned by Abramovich, which you had to be a little more careful about because he was an oligarch, but we did a lot with them. One of the reasons is that the chief financial, corporate finance officer happened to be English and a friend of mine. So I was able to work with that company through the eyes and hands of an Englishman who I trusted a lot more than, others at that time. So that was a window to work with him. But that was another company we did a lot with back in those days. And, lots of different companies, frankly. But that's
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
examples of
Two
Russian companies.
examples and ones that you
We
like.
did billions of dollars of financing with these companies.
Yeah.
Now,
And
another story, here's another one,
yeah.
totally different. I started getting to know Nizhnekamsk, Neftahim. Now, this client existed before I got there, but I don't know, probably not, they weren't doing much at all with us. But Nizhnekamsk, Neftahim was it was a chemicals producer, like uh, PC and other kinds of industrial chemicals and plastics. They were based in Tatarstan in the city of Nizhnekamsk, 1 hour north of Kazan in the Republic of Tatarstan, smack in the middle of Russia. So I flew out to see them on these aging, Tupolovs, which I'm still alive to tell the story, luckily. And I started meeting them, and this company was great. They were obviously very traditional, but they were expanding. They were building new factories with Western equipment. And I arranged several, $100 million financings to help them build new factories. And working with them was really a cultural, opportunity. These were not even Russians, these were Tartars. They
Right.
spoke, when they wanted to talk to each other, they didn't even speak in Russian, they were speaking in Tartar.
Yeah.
But I was doing, great stuff for them because, it was very enjoyable and rewarding to actually see a factory being built. And I have to be honest, most of the financing we saw in Moscow, which did represent the vast bulk of business in Russia, because so much economic wealth was centered in Moscow and the environs. It was mainly for working capital finance. I tell you, how much of that money ultimately went to pay dividends to the oligarchs? Probably a lot more than I'd ever imagined,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
got those. And once you give them the money, unless you're financing receipts of equipment, you're never exactly sure what they're doing with that. You're always reading their financial statements. It's working capital. Okay, that's legitimate. You're not financing anything that's corrupt or, a bloated invoice. You're not doing that. But still, money is fungible, and that's what was happening back in those early 2000s. A lot of it, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. But in Nizhnekamsk, nothing like that. It was basically, we want to build a factory. We want to buy this Italian petrochemical equipment. Can you help us finance that? And I did it in conjunction with the Italian Export Credit Agency, other, financing arms. And we saw factories being built. And working with Tartars was great. Even the president of Tatarstan personally went to the factory and wanted to have lunch with me, thanking me for bringing all of this foreign capital to help Tatarstan grow. That was great for every possible reason.
Yeah. And for this kind of business, were you competing with Russian banks at all, or was it?
No, no, no. In those days, Russian banks couldn't do anything like that. They didn't have the personnel, they didn't have the access, they didn't have the training, they didn't have the capital, they didn't have the systems, they had nothing. They could not. Now, of course, right before 2022, that situation had changed. Banks like VTB, Sberbank really, got their act together, and they expanded, they adopted a Western management technology, product skills, systems, computer,
Right. Did they poach personnel from you guys?
Um, of course, of
Yeah.
course, of course. It was the most logical hunting ground. Citibank was always a prime hunting ground for talent. It was the best of the best. If you wanted a skilled Russian banker, try to steal him for Citibank. But of course, it wasn't just Citibank. There were other banks, but Citibank certainly was prime hunting ground.
Right. Right. And so your role was in client relations, client development, as much as the nuts and bolts of the lending.
Of course, yeah, I was
Yeah.
involved. And of course, I was involved in compliance. I was the first line of defense, to basically say, hey, these are guys we could probably work with, or no, 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 no. From what we know, this company is going to be off limits. And
Right.
in Citibank, we had three lines of defense. So the first line of defense is, the front office officers like myself who identify business opportunities, propose how to structure them, what tools, what products to use, what programs to take advantage of. And then it would go to our legal staff that would look at all the legal implications. That's the second line of defense. And the third line of defense is compliance, which basically, has another fresh view and say, well, based on Citi's global policies and our policies in Russia and in similar countries and situations, this is something that we probably could do, or this is something that just doesn't meet our compliance standards. So we had
Right.
3 lines of defense to, keep ourselves from doing something we shouldn't do.
Right. Did your compliance people speak Russian? Or did they use Russian, I don't know, investigators to help them?
What we used, some of them were Russian, but they were mainly foreigners because compliance in those days was a very technical, high level skill that only foreigners had. So
Yeah,
Russians didn't even know in the early 2000s what the hell that meant, compliance. So
right,
forget that. It was basically foreigners. But of course, the foreigners did have Russian staff to help them look at all the Russian documentation because that was critical. Although most of the lending and capital extensions were all based on English or American law, never on Russian law.
right. But the underlying information that you gathered,
It was, yeah, of course, it was from Russian sources, and
Russian sources.
you had to, analyze that very, very carefully and double check it. We did hire a lot of professional due diligence firms that employed Russian staff, ex-FSB or police, God
Right,
knows the people they employed. But I knew some of the people they employed, and they were that kind of profile.
right,
And
right,
they did independent due diligence reports on, this shareholder, or how did this company form, or where did this money come from? You always want to know, where did the money come from?
right, right. Yeah, I mean, the Russian business people are incredibly creative in structuring their business and maintaining their privacy. So
Yeah,
that's sort of why I was curious of how you gathered the underlying information.
yeah.
Requires someone like that that has an investigatory background to know, like, how do you search for that? How do
Yeah,
you
we spent
know?
a lot of money on Kroll and these other international due diligence firms.
Yeah,
Very important, especially if you're starting off with a new client. Before you engage, you got to make sure you know who you're dealing with
right,
and you're comfortable with it.
right. So in this period when the business is booming, if you will, was it your assumption that it would always be this way and that Russia was inextricably integrated into this world economic system that you were also a major part of as Citibank?
That perspective changed, and it started to change in the fall of 2003 when Putin engineered the takeover of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Yukos. And that was a big bucket of cold water on the face. Now, first, Yukos was one of Citi's best customers at that time. And I
Mm,
still remember reading the news that Sechin and Rosneft were going to take over Yukos. And I remember leaving Yukos's office around that time, going back to Citi's office, going, oh, well, we just lost one of our best customers.
yeah,
And when that happened, we realized things were starting to change. That the state was taking over, asserting its control. It's well documented, the process, the beginning of the power vertical, you might say, the beginning of this process of increased state ownership and control of the jewels of Russian industry, you might say. So things started to change. And that was not the only, you know, episode. There were other episodes where companies started to fall under state control, and it forced us to reevaluate, can we work with this company anymore? Because the shareholders are different, and guess what? It seems like this company is now fulfilling the state's wishes rather than an independent business, you know, value driven perspective, you might say.
right,
So
right,
that changed the way we looked at companies. And as time progressed, it became more and more, pronounced that this shift was happening. And you basically start fine tuning your client base, taking into account these very clear, these very inexorable changes to the Russian, economic structure and system.
And this was sort of well understood within the bank.
Yeah, it was. I think we did not make any mistakes in this regard. I think we saw it coming, and we were, going, following it carefully and adjusting our marketing policies and our approach accordingly. But I tell you, Yukos being taken over was, and don't forget what was happening to all of the clients, the people I knew, like Steve Ridlington, who was, arrested and kept, incommunicado in his office and had to flee, or, Jameson Firestone, a lawyer who had to flee. These are people who fled for their lives. I still remember another very interesting story, again, helping you understand this transition.
Yeah.
An incredible, unforgettable dinner I had with Red Letter. Who wrote that book? It was
Oh, yeah, I know who you mean. Bill
Browder. Bill Browder.
Wow.
So Bill Browder and I and a few other people were having dinner sometime, I guess, in the summer of 2005. I remember this. In a lovely restaurant just a few blocks walk from Citibank's office on Goshika Street, 8 Goshika Street. I still remember the specific address. We're having dinner and we're talking about Gazprom because Gazprom was one of his biggest clients and biggest investments. And he goes, I never invest in a Russian company unless I understand its ABISA. And, and I asked him, ABISA, what does that mean? I knew this is an accounting term. I knew what EBIT is. EBIT is earnings before interest and tax. I knew what EBITDA was, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And I go, Bill, I never heard of ABISA. What is that? He goes, Steve, it's very simple. Earnings before interest, earnings before interest and stealing. ABISA, earnings before interest, stealing, and whatever else. And I was like, okay, I got you. And I go, well, that is a very logical thing, but quite dangerous. And within months, he was expelled from Russia. He dug too deep. He insisted on maintaining a Western standard, anti-corruption standard, and that cost him his job. And if he stayed, it would have cost him his life.
Yeah.
So that was another interesting, what I call, milestone in this transformation from the early 2000s, like starting in 2002, basically, to fall of 2003 with Yukos, the Bill Browder episode in the summer of 2005. And, it just got worse. So by the 2010, we really, Citi had been focusing more on investment grade rated Russian government assets rather than a lot of these individual corporations. So it was starting to narrow its credit focus based on the continuing, transformation of the Russian economic structure.
I see. And how long did you stay?
I left in March 2010. I probably overstayed my welcome. I probably should have left in 2008, but sometimes when you're working, in a career, you don't move exactly when you want to. So I got out in March 2010, and where did I go? I moved to Kiev, and I became the country manager of Citibank's Ukraine operations, which was very, very logical because I was covering Ukraine when I was based in Russia. We weren't doing that much in Ukraine at the time, but I was familiar with the country. I certainly knew all the tricks, and how you looked at Ukraine was not much different than how you looked at Russia. The same demand for extreme due diligence and caution, although Ukraine was far riskier in those days. It was never an investment grade country, whereas Russia was for many years when I was there. And I was the country manager of Citibank in Ukraine from 2010 to 2018 when I retired from Citi in 2018. And then 1 year after that, I served on the board of Bank in 2019. And by the beginning of 2020, I basically was no longer, physically or heavily engaged in Ukraine. And I started my sort of writing career, you might say.
Writing career, yeah. So how long did Citi stay in Russia?
Right. Well, Citi was still there in 2022 when the war happened, when the invasion happened in February. And I think it is still there because it still has some legal obligations to wind down with its commercial bank back office operations in Rizan and some other areas. Citi is still physically there. It certainly has not been doing any new business since 2022.
Okay,
And it's scaled down dramatically, but I still think there are some vestigial remnants of the operation only because of legal obligations to close out transactions that, for whatever reason, still were not closed out. And sometimes it just be for a foreign company that says, hey, you promised to do this for me, and it had a 3-year time horizon to it. You better finish what you promised to do. And in that
right.
situation, Citibank just said, okay, well, we're just going to have to close this out. And the sooner we close it out, then we can close up shop completely.
I see. I see. Okay. Well, look, I think we covered the things I wanted to cover, unless there are things that you wanted to talk about that we didn't touch. Um,
Well, Daniel, the question is there going to be round three?
uh,
If round one was 1916 to 1918, round
right,
two was 1993, ultimately to 2022. And in each round, Western companies lost an enormous amount of money. You know, the amount of money lost by foreign companies exiting Russia starting 2014, particularly after 2022, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
hmm
So, two lessons learned. Will there be a round three? And will we understand history and make sure we don't repeat it once again? Time will tell.
Time will tell. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I think that's a good note to end the interview here with.